Hey guys, welcome back. Welcome to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 17th Vice President of the United States, Schuyler Colfax. Of course, this is TJ here with Dead History. Welcome. Hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday, taking a look at the early life and early political rise, of course, of Schuyler Colfax. And now in part 2, we're going to be talking about the presidency and obviously his legacy and that sort of thing. So that's pretty much, going to be the overview here for part 2. One quick reminder to everyone, please tune in tonight live on this YouTube channel at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, Friday, December 10th. For a very special live stream with me and Dr. Joe Fakosh, who is the podcaster for Visiting the Presidents. It's going to be a lot of fun. Joe and I are going to be talking about, of course, presidential birthplaces and homes and different sites and locations, and, of course, grave sites. Joe has seen it all. If you guys think that I've been everywhere, which, I've been a lot of places, no doubt, Joe trumps me by a lot. So, stay tuned for that tonight. It's going to be a lot of fun. So, okay, I am riding solo here for the audio, so let's jump right in and learn about the vice presidency and legacy of Schuyler Colfax. Here we go. From Speaker to Vice President. As the 1868 presidential election approached, Speaker Colfax believed the nomination of Ulysses S. Grant to be resistless. As for himself, he declined to run either for the Senate or for governor of Indiana, leaving the door open for the vice presidential nomination. Colfax insisted that presiding over the House as Speaker was the more important office than presiding over the Senate as vice president. But the vice presidency was the more direct avenue to the presidency. At the convention, his chief rivals for the second spot were Senate President pro tempore Ben Wade and Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson. Colfax polled fourth on the first ballot and gained steadily with each subsequent ballot. The temperance forces were delighted that Colfax's headquarters distributed no liquor, in contrast to Senator Wade, who handed out spirits freely among the delegates. Among Republicans, there was a collective sense that the abstinent Colfax would balance a ticket with Grant, who had been known to drink heavily. Colfax stayed in Washington while the Republican convention met in Chicago. His good friend, William Orton, head of the Western Union Telegraph Company, arranged for Colfax to receive dispatches from the convention every 10 minutes. On May 21st, Colfax was in the Speaker's lobby when he received Orton's telegram announcing his nomination. Cheers broke out, and the room quickly filled with congressmen wishing to offer congratulations. As he left the lobby, Colfax was greeted by House staff members who gathered around him in the most affectionate manner and tendered him their regards. Citizens hailed him as he walked across the Capitol grounds. On the Senate side, bluff Ben Wade received the news that he had been beaten and said, "Well, I guess it will be all right. He deserves it, and he will be a good presiding officer." The news was received with seemingly universal applause. "His friends love him devotedly," wrote one admirer, "and his political adversaries respect him thoroughly." For years, Colfax had addressed Sunday schools and temperance revival meetings, quoting from the Bible and urging his listeners to a life of virtue. He won support from the religious magazines as a Christian statesman. One campaign biography praised his spotless integrity and declared, "So pure is his personal character that the venom of political enmity has never attempted to fix a stain upon it. Democrats, however, lambasted Colfax as a bigot for the anti-Catholicism of his know-nothing past Republicans, dismissed these charges as mudslinging and organized Irish and German Grant and Colfax clubs to court the Catholic and foreign-born vote. Although it was not known at the time, Ulysses Grant had also once joined the Know-Nothings and apparently shared their anti-Catholic prejudices. In November of 1868, Grant and Colfax were narrowly elected over the Democratic ticket headed by New York Governor Horatio Seymour. Days after the election, the vice president-elect married Ellen Wade, niece of the Ohio senator he had defeated for the vice presidential nomination. The groom was 45 and the bride about 30, an attractive and charming woman. By April of 1870, their son Schuyler III was born. This domestic bliss would in fact contribute to Colfax's political undoing. As a married man, he found less time to socialize with his old friends in the press, and invitations to the lavish receptions at his new home became harder for reporters to receive, causing considerable resentment among his old friends on Newspaper Row, who thought he was putting on airs. Not a wealthy man, the new vice president could never say no to a gift. He grew indiscreet in his acceptance of everything from sterling silver to free railroad passes. In 1868, Colfax also accepted some railroad stocks from his friend Representative Oakes Ames, who promised handsome dividends. Neither suspected the political price that the stock would ultimately exact. Plans to retire. The first Speaker of the House ever elected Vice President, a previous former Speaker, James K. Polk, had won the presidency in 1844. Colfax moved easily to the Senate chamber as a man long familiar with the ways of Capitol Hill. The Senate proved an easier body to preside over, leaving him with time on his hands to travel, lecture, and write for the press. The Indianapolis Journal observed that the vice presidency is an elegant office whose occupant must find it his principal business to try to discover what is the use of there being such an office at all. Colfax consulted periodically with President Grant, but as one Democratic paper sneered, the vice president carried more wind than weight. His distance from the president proved not to be a disadvantage when various scandals began to tarnish Grant and his administration. Speculation soon arose that Colfax would replace Grant in the next election. There was much surprise, therefore, when in September of 1870, at age 47, Colfax announced that he intended to retire at the end of his term. "I will then have had 18 years of continuous service at Washington, mostly on a stormy sea, long enough for anyone, and my ambition is all gratified and satisfied." This was an old tactic for Colfax, who periodically before had announced his retirement and then changed his mind. He's like some pro athletes of today. He's like Michael Jordan or Brett Favre. Some believed he intended the announcement to further separate himself from the Grant administration and open the way for the presidential nomination in 1872. But the national press and Senator Henry Wilson took the announcement at face value, and before long, the movement to replace him went further than Colfax had anticipated. Colfax predictably changed his mind early in 1872 and acceded to the wishes of his friends that he stand for re-election on the old ticket. President Grant may have questioned Colfax's intentions. In 1871, the president sent his vice president an extraordinary letter informing him that Secretary of State Hamilton Fish wished to retire and asking him in plain English to give up the vice presidency for the State Department. Grant appeared to be removing Colfax as a potential rival. "In all my heart, I hope you will say yes," he wrote, "though I confess the sacrifice you will be making." Colfax declined, and a year later, when Senator Wilson challenged Colfax for renomination, the president chose to remain neutral in the contest. For a man who had assiduously courted the press for so long, Colfax found himself abandoned by the Washington correspondents who overwhelmingly supported Henry Wilson. Colfax's slide in the opinion of the Washington press corps had its roots in a dinner at the beginning of his term as vice president when he had lectured them on the need to exercise their responsibilities prudently, since in their hands lay the making and unmaking of great men. The reporters had noted archly that Colfax, like other politicians, had never complained about the making of their reputations, just the unmaking. Mary Clemmer Ames, a popular newspaper writer in Washington, attributed Colfax's downfall to envy within the press corps. He did not invite them to his dinners and receptions, so they decided to write him down. The naturally cynical and skeptical reporters, apparently considering the vice president's sanctimonious contradictory to his newfound riches and opulent lifestyle, sought to take him down a few pegs. And I should say the vice president's sanctimoniousness. One correspondent likened Colfax to a penny dip burning high on the altar among the legitimate tapers of state. By contrast, the reporters liked Senator Wilson, who leaked so freely that they dubbed him the official reporter of the secret executive sessions of the Senate. Colfax bitterly charged that Wilson had invited newspapermen in nearly every evening, asking them to telegraph that he was gaining steadily, that I did not care for it. When he lost the nomination, the vice president magnanimously shook Senator Wilson's hand, but one observer noticed that his famous smile had become a whitened skeleton of its former self. At least, Colfax's defeat spared him having to run against his old mentor, Horace Greeley, presidential candidate that year, on a fusion ticket of Democrats and liberal Republicans. Pretty interesting stuff. Basically a lame duck vice president, only one term. The Credit Mobilier Scandal. So I don't know if it's Credit Mobilier or Mobilier, however you pronounce it. I've even heard people pronounce it the Credit, instead of credit, like Credit Mobilier Scandal. So the Credit, most people will tell you it's the Credit Mobilier Scandal, but I think it's more like Credit Mobilier Scandal. So whatever, hopefully somebody can correct me. I've heard it literally pronounced by historians several different ways, so who knows. As a man still in his 40s, Colfax might well have continued his political career after the vice presidency, except for his connection to the worst scandal in 19th century U.S. political history. In September of 1872, as the presidential campaign was getting underway, the New York Sun broke the 4-year-old story about the Credit Mobilier, a finance company created to underwrite construction of the transcontinental Union Pacific Railroad. Since the railroad depended on federal subsidies, the company had recruited Massachusetts Representative Oakes Ames to distribute stock among the key members of Congress who could help them the most. Some members had paid for the stock at a low value, others had put no money down at all, but simply let the generous dividends pay for the stock. Apologize for the buzzing. I was getting a phone call. On Oakes Ames's list were the names of both Schuyler Colfax and Henry Wilson, along with such other Washington luminaries as Representatives James Garfield and James G. Blaine. In South Bend, Indiana, Vice President Colfax made a public statement that completely disassociated himself from Credit Mobilier, assuring his listeners that he never owned $1 of stock that he had not paid for. On January 7th of 1873, the House committee investigating the Credit Mobilier Scandal called the vice president to testify. Ames claimed that since Colfax had lacked the money to buy the stock had been paid for by its own inflated dividends. Ames's notes indicated that Colfax had received an additional $1,200 in dividends. On the stand, Colfax swore flatly that he had never received a dividend check from Ames, but his testimony was contradicted by evidence from the files of the House Sergeant at Arms. Without missing a beat, Colfax insisted that Ames himself must have signed and cashed the check. Then the committee produced evidence from Colfax's Washington bank that 2 days after the payment had been made, he had deposited $1,200 in cash, and the deposit slip was in Colfax's own handwriting. Taking 2 weeks to explain, Colfax claimed that he had received $200 from his stepfather, who worked as a clerk in the House of Representatives, and another $1,000 from George Nesbitt, a campaign contributor by then deceased. This story seems so patently self-serving and far-fetched that even his strongest supporters dismissed it. Making matters worse, the committee disclosed evidence suggesting that Nesbitt, who manufactured stationery, had bribed Colfax as chairman of the House Post Office Committee in order to receive government contracts for envelopes. A resolution to impeach Colfax failed to pass by a mostly party-line vote, in part because just a few weeks remained in his term. The pious statesman had been exposed, and the public was unforgiving. Colfax left the vice presidency in disgrace, becoming a symbol of the sordidness of Gilded Age politics. Later in 1873, when the failure of the transcontinental railroads to make their bond payments triggered a disastrous financial collapse on Wall Street, plunging the nation into a depression that lasted for the rest of the decade, one ruined investor muttered that it was all Schuyler Colfax's fault. Damn him. Pretty crazy stuff. We're going to touch a little bit more on the Credit Mobilier Scandal here in a few minutes. But pretty crazy stuff when it came to Colfax and that whole scandal. Definitely seems like he had some wrongdoing there, no doubt. Later years. Others implicated in Credit Mobilier survived politically. Henry Wilson was elected vice president. James Garfield became president in 1880, and James G. Blaine won the Republican presidential nomination, but not the election in 1884. Colfax, however, returned to private life in South Bend, Indiana. Briefly, there was talk that his friend William Wharton would put up the funds to enable him to purchase the prestigious New York Tribune after Horace Greeley's death in 1872, but the deal fell through. Then a new opportunity developed. Called upon to deliver a short speech at the unveiling of a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, Colfax discovered that the public had an insatiable appetite for information about their martyred president. He commenced a lucrative career as a public lecturer, up to $2,500 per speech, on his wartime relationship with Lincoln. From time to time, Colfax's name surfaced as a candidate for the House or the Senate, or for the presidential nomination, but he declined to become a candidate. You can't imagine the repugnance with which I now view the service of the many-headed public. He wrote, with all its toils, its innumerable exactions of all kinds, the never-ending work and worry, the explanations about everything which the public think they have a right to, the lack of independence as to your goings and comings, the misunderstandings, the inveighings, backbitings, etc., etc., etc. On January 13th of 1885, on his way back to a speaking engagement in Iowa, Colfax was stricken by a heart attack and died while waiting at a railroad station in Mankato, Minnesota, where the temperature dipped to 30 below zero. Unrecognized by those around him, the former Speaker and Vice President was identified only by papers in his pocket. Doggerel from a critical newspaper, perhaps, served as the epitaph for Schuyler Colfax's rise to national prominence and precipitous fall from grace. A beautiful smiler came in our midst, too lively and fair to remain. They stretched him on racks till the soul of Colfax flapped up into heaven again. May the fate of poor Schuyler warn men of a smiler, who dividends gets on the brain. And there you have it, guys. The 17th Vice President of the United States, Schuyler Colfax. I'm going to read you some other things here just about his life, about the scandal, just some facts that we've kind of already touched on, but, I like to go over things very thoroughly, so I will touch on those now. So I'm just going to run through, just kind of an overview. I mean, a lot of these things kind of repeat what we've already said. We know that. Well, with the Whig Party collapsing, he joined the newly formed Republican Party, where he ran for Congress, winning a seat that he would hold from 1855 to 1869, and serving as Speaker of the House from 1863 to the end of his term. As an opponent of slavery, Colfax joined the Radical Republicans and strongly supported the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Bill, and the Reconstruction Acts. After the Civil War, Colfax clashed with President Andrew Johnson over Reconstruction and voted for his impeachment in 1868. Ulysses S. Grant selected Colfax as his running mate during his bid for the presidency in 1868, and upon Grant's election, Colfax served as vice president from 1869 to 1873. Unfortunately, Colfax was implicated in the Credit Mobilier Scandal in 1872, which damaged his reputation and cost him the renomination for vice president the same year. After leaving office, Schuyler Colfax embarked on a successful career as a lecturer till his death in 1885. What else here? A little bit more about Grant. Colfax made it clear that he wanted to be, as the election of 1868 approached, Colfax made it clear that he wanted to be the vice presidential candidate for the Republicans to run with General Ulysses S. Grant, who was the presidential candidate. The pair easily won the election. Colfax was considered a fine vice president and an effective leader of the Senate, but as was typical, he did not have much involvement in the Grant administration. In 1870, he announced his retirement but changed his mind by early 1872, and it was too late by that time. However, and the Republicans had picked Senator Henry Wilson to run with Grant in the 1872 election. Vice President Colfax did not escape the scandals that engulfed the Grant administration. During the lame duck session of Congress in 1872, he became caught up in the Credit Mobilier Scandal. It involved railroad companies overcharging millions of dollars for government contracts and the company's directors bribing various government officials with company shares. In January of 1873, Colfax appeared before a House committee to defend himself against the charges that he had accepted shares in 1868. Although he was never convicted of any wrongdoing, he was not cleared either, and his reputation suffered. After stepping down as vice president in 1873, Colfax retired and returned to Indiana. He had remarried in 1868, and 2 years later he became a father for the first time. Leaving public life, he began a lucrative career as a public speaker. So there's that, of course. Again, just kind of going over these facts, so to speak, again. Colfax, a representative from Indiana and a vice president of the United States, was born in New York, attended the common schools. In 1836, moved with his parents to New Carlisle, Indiana. It's the same old stuff here. He died in Mankato, Minnesota, which is in Blue Earth County, on January 13th of 1885. Just making sure there's nothing else here. So, of course, I always like to do this. The election of 1868. Of course, that's when Grant and Colfax ran together, and they were elected. It was the Republican Ulysses S. Grant with his running mate Schuyler Colfax, and they went up against the Democrat Horatio Seymour of New York and his running mate Francis Preston Blair Jr. They won the electoral vote 214 to 80. They carried 26 states to Seymour's 8, and they won the popular vote with 52.7% of the popular vote. So they did win pretty handedly. You're seeing some posters and some, different maps and stuff of that election. So just so you can kind of get an idea of that, of course. What else can I tell you guys here? So we know the election of 1868. I just said that. Colfax was selected for vice president on the 5th ballot. Colfax was popular among Republicans for his friendly character, party loyalty, and radical views on Reconstruction. Among Republicans, he was known as Schuyler Colfax. On March 3rd of 1869, the final full day of the 40th Congress, Colfax, who was to be sworn into office as vice president the next day, resigned as speaker. Immediately afterward, the House passed a motion declaring Theodore Pomeroy duly elected speaker in place of Colfax. In office for 1 day, his is the shortest tenure of any speaker of the U.S. House. So that's pretty cool. Didn't know that. A little fun fact about his successor as speaker. Colfax was inaugurated on March 4th of 1869, and he served until March 4th of 1873. Grant and Colfax, 46 and 45 respectively at the time of their inauguration, were the youngest presidential and vice presidential team until the inauguration of Bill Clinton and Al Gore in 1993. So they stood as the youngest president and vice presidential team for about 120 years. So pretty crazy stuff. Colfax and John Nance Garner, the first vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, are the only two vice presidents to have been Speaker of the House of Representatives prior to becoming vice president. And since the vice president is the president of the Senate, they are the only two people to have served as the presiding officer of both houses of Congress. Pretty interesting. Didn't know that. Italian Unity on Friday, January 6th of 1871 from Washington, D.C. In a letter published in the New York Times, Colfax recognized and rejoiced in King Victor Emmanuel II's victory of unifying Italy and setting up a new government in Rome. Colfax encouraged Italy to form a republican government that protected religious freedom, regardless of faith, and the civil rights of all individuals, including those who lived in poverty. Colfax said, "For out of this new life of civil and religious liberty will flow peace and happiness, progress and prosperity, with material and national development and advancement, as surely as healthy springs flow from fountains of purity." Pretty interesting. The election of 1872, we know that. Colfax was not chosen. The Credit Mobilier Scandal, September of 1872. During the presidential campaign, Colfax's reputation was marred by a New York Sun article which indicated that he was involved in the Credit Mobilier Scandal. So, of course, we know all that. Colfax was denied involvement to the press and defended himself in person before a House investigation committee, testifying in January of 1873 that he had never received a dividend check from Ames. We touched on that earlier. His political career was ruined. Colfax left office under a cloud at the end of his term and never ran for office again. His only consolation on that bitterly cold March day was a handwritten letter from Ulysses Grant. In it, the president wrote, "I sympathize with you in the recent congressional investigations, that I have watched them closely, and that I am satisfied now, as I ever have been, of your integrity, patriotism, and freedom from the charges imputed, as if I knew of my own knowledge your innocence. Our official relations have been so pleasant that I would like to keep up the personal relations engendered through life." Pretty interesting that Grant wrote him that letter after the whole scandal and everything. Then he became a lecturer and a business executive, of course. After leaving office in March of 1873, Colfax began to recover his reputation, embarking on a successful career as a traveling lecturer, offering speeches on a variety of topics. His most requested presentation was one on the life of Abraham Lincoln, whom the nation had become to turn into an icon. With an expanding population that desired to know more details and context about Lincoln's life and career, an oration from someone who had known him personally was an attraction audiences were willing to pay to hear, and Colfax delivered his Lincoln lecture hundreds of times to positive reviews. In 1875, he became vice president of the Indiana Reaper and Iron Company. On February 12th of 1875, having returned to Washington, D.C. to give a lecture, he advised his friends in Congress who were frustrated over the slow pace of action. The way to get out of politics is to get out of politics. He had remained popular in his home area and was often encouraged to run again for public office, but he always declined. Finally, in April of 1882, when pressed to consider becoming a candidate for his old U.S. House seat in the upcoming election, Colfax announced in a letter to the South Bend Tribune that, while he had deeply appreciated how much his friends wanted him to run for public office again, he was satisfied by the 20 years of service he had given during the stormiest years of our nation's history. He also said that he was enjoying his life as a private citizen and would neither be a candidate nor accept any nomination for any office in the future, stating, "Only ambition now is to go in and out among my townsmen as a private citizen during what years of life may remain for me to enjoy on this earth." Colfax, of course, was married twice. On October 10th of 1844, he married his childhood friend Evelyn Clark. She died in 1863, and they had no children. On November 18th of 1868, 2 weeks after winning the vice presidency, he married Ella M. Wade, a niece of Senator Benjamin Wade. They had one son, Schuyler Colfax III, who served as mayor of South Bend, Indiana from 1898 to 1901. He assumed office at the age of 28, and he remains the youngest person to become mayor in the city's history. Colfax was a member of the Independent Order of Old Fellows. In 1850 and 51, Colfax, along with members William T. Martin of Mississippi and E.G. Steele of Tennessee, were appointed to prepare a ritual of ceremonies pertaining to the Rebecca degree and report at the 1851 session. On September 20th of 1851, the IOOF approved the degree, and Colfax was considered the author and founder. In 1854, Colfax was initiated into Beta Theta Pi fraternity at DePauw University as an honorary member. On January 13th of 1885, Colfax walked from Mankato, Minnesota's Front Street Depot to the Omaha Depot, about 3/4 of a mile in minus 30 degree below zero weather, intending to change trains on his way to Rock Rapids, Iowa, to give a speech. 5 minutes after arriving, Colfax died of a heart attack brought on by the extreme cold and exhaustion. He was buried at City Cemetery in South Bend, Indiana. A historical marker in Mankato's Washington Park, site of the former depot, marks the spot where he died. His historical reputation: Colfax's 20 years of public service ended in controversy in 1873 due to the revelation that he was involved in the Credit Mobilier Scandal. He never returned to seek political office, in part because he believed that it was the best way to stay out of politics once leaving office, and in part because he was content with his life as a private citizen. Because of his success as a lecturer, his reputation was somewhat restored. Towns in the U.S. states of California, North Carolina, Illinois, Washington, Wisconsin, Indiana, Iowa, Texas, and Louisiana are named after him. Schuyler, Nebraska, named after Colfax, is the county seat of Colfax County, Nebraska. The ghost town of Colfax, Colorado, was named after him, as was Colfax County, New Mexico. Colfax Avenue in South Bend is named in his honor. Colfax's home of his adult years stood on that street at 601 West Market Street. The city later renamed the street in his honor. The Colfax home was demolished, and a Seventh-day Adventist church, church, that actually stands on the spot as of in 2019. There's another Colfax Avenue in Indiana, city just east of South Bend. Colfax Place, bunch of streets named for him throughout the country. Colfax School was built in South Bend and opened in 1898, just a few blocks from the Schuyler Colfax home. Pretty interesting stuff there. Schuyler Colfax home in Wayne, New Jersey, which was built by Colfax's ancestors, was added to the National Register of Historical Places in 1973. Pretty cool. Actor Bill Raymond portrayed Colfax during his time as speaker in the 2012 Steven Spielberg film Lincoln. Raymond was in his early 70s when the film was made, while Colfax was in his early 40s during the period depicted in the film. So there you go, guys. And of course, his gravesite there, as I said, in the city cemetery. There's actually one more thing I do want to read to you guys about Schuyler Colfax. So before I get into his gravesite, let me touch on that. Schuyler, March 4th of 1869. In his day, he was widely considered a cunning and duplicitous vice president. Today, he is virtually unknown. In the third quarter of the 19th century, Indiana Republican Schuyler Colfax loomed large on the American political stage. He entered public life in 1854 by winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. By 1863, he had risen to that body's speakership. One observer described Colfax as presiding in rather a slapdash, knock-em-down auctioneer style, greatly in variance with the decorous dignity of his predecessors, or decorous. Despite this, colleagues considered him the best House Speaker since Henry Clay. But some harbored doubts about this man, nicknamed Schuyler. President Lincoln counted him a friend, but also an untrustworthy intriguer aspiring beyond his capacity. In 1868, Schuyler Colfax won his party's vice presidential nomination on a ticket with Ulysses Grant. The Teetotalian House Speaker nicely balanced the hard-drinking general. After their inauguration, Colfax found his duties as president of the Senate less demanding than those of the speakership. One Indiana newspaper observed that the vice presidency is an elegant office whose occupant must make it his principal business to try to discover what is the use of there being such an office at all. He consulted regularly with Grant, but one Democratic newspaper sneered that the vice president carried more wind than weight. Colfax lost a bid for the second vice presidential term in 1872 to Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson, a favorite of the Washington press corps, because of his willingness to leak details of the Senate's frequent closed-door executive sessions. The final months of Colfax's term coincided with the eruption of the largest scandal in the 19th century American political history. Seeking inflated federal funding for construction of its transcontinental rail line, the Union Pacific Company had secretly lobbied influential senators and representatives with generous gifts of company stock. When the list of those members inevitably surfaced, it included 8 senators and the vice president. Colfax adamantly denied involvement in the Credit Mobilier affair, but with each denial came irrefutable evidence of his guilt. Only the expiration of his term saved that disgraced vice president from impeachment. Schuyler Colfax eventually joined the lecture circuit, where he earned huge sums for talks on his wartime relationship with President Lincoln. On a sub-zero winter's day in 1885, traveling to a speaking engagement, he suffered a fatal heart attack in a Minnesota train station. Unrecognized by those around him, the 62-year-old former speaker and vice president was identified only by the papers in his pocket. So as I said, he is buried in City Cemetery in South Bend, Indiana. There's actually a couple really good articles that you can look up. One is about the South Bend City Cemetery basically going to crap, for lack of a better term. There was a bunch of historical landmarks and such there. They were being vandalized, and they were being defaced, and some of them were just becoming, beyond repair as far as their condition and just not being taken care of and kept up. And I know Schuyler Colfax's grave itself, I'm trying to remember exactly what I had read once, but it basically was, there used to be an angel at the top of his gravesite. I'm actually going to put a couple pictures of previous pictures of that angel that was at the top. There was this little angel statue at the top of Colfax's gravesite, which you're probably seeing now on your screen. That used to be there. That's no longer there. That was defaced and vandalized. Somebody actually took down and cut off that angel and kept it. They vandalized his grave, and it's never been replaced. So you see the angel in one picture, and then now you're probably seeing my pictures, or a couple of my pictures from my visit. There's no angel. So unbelievable. The City Cemetery in South Bend, Indiana, where Schuyler Colfax is buried, definitely has needed a lot of work. I know over the last 5 years or so, the city has definitely done a lot to try to bring it back, but definitely pretty interesting stuff. So there you go, guys. That's the life, legacy, vice presidency, death, and gravesite of our 17th Vice President of the United States, Schuyler Colfax. Hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned. I will show you my pictures and bonus footage of my visit, of course, to the City Cemetery. All of my photos will be in bonus footage. And stay tuned for next week for our 18th Vice President of the United States, who is Henry Wilson. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for joining. Thank you for everything. Don't forget to watch tonight our live stream with Dr. Joe Fakosh. It's going to be a lot of fun. Stay tuned for that. Thank you for everything, guys. Can't thank you guys enough. And we will see you tonight at the live stream, and then next week for our next Vice Presidential Series installment. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now.